Hebrews chapter 2, and we're going to start in we're just reading 2 verses here and then flip into chapter 9. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 14. Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself, we're talking about Jesus here, he himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. And then flip back with me to Hebrews chapter 9. And just as it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. This is God's word. You can go ahead and be seated. So I'm guessing at least some of us saw the news this week, but if you didn't, Hugh Hefner passed away this week, and it was interesting to watch the responses. I don't know about you, but there were some people that you saw who were celebrating his life, right? Innovative, the ultimate player. I saw people praising him. And then other people who were really critical of him. I have certain strong opinions myself, but this morning I don't want to talk about his life. What I want to ask you to think about is his death. And here's the question I want you to process for just a moment. Sometime this week, I don't even know the exact day it was. I didn't look that deep into it. I just know he died. But sometime this week, Hugh Hefner breathed his last breath in this world. What happened next? It's an interesting question to think about. And it's an important one, not just in terms of Hugh, but here's what it's really important question about you. What happens next for you? Right, there's two facts, two truths that these two passages here in Hebrews are getting at here. Right? Number one. Right, if you're still there in chapter 9, look at verse 27 again. Hebrews 9, verse 27, what does it say? And just as it appointed for man to what? To die once. Here's the fact, here's the reality. Every single person in this room faces an inevitable conclusion. It doesn't matter how much you work at it, doesn't matter how much you exercise, it doesn't matter how much health food you eat. It doesn't matter how much you invest in anti-aging creams. It doesn't matter how hard you work at it. The inevitable conclusion is at some point in time in the future, you will face the same day that Hugh faced this last week, where you are coming to the conclusion of your life, where you will breathe your last breath in this world. It's coming. Sir Walter Scott, who is a historical novelist, a playwright, and poet, puts it this way. He says, "O mighty death, those whom none could otherwise convince, thou hast persuaded. Those whom all others flattered, thou hast despised. Thou hast fetched all greatness, all the pride, all the cruelty, power, and ambition of humanity, and covered it all over with these two little words, here lies." All of your hopes, all of your dreams, all of your passions, all of ideas, innovations, hard work, jobs, titles, homes, possessions, bank accounts, all of it at some point in time will be brought under the powerful reality of death. That's fact number one. Just as it is appointed for man to die once. Fact number two, most people are scared to death of that. Most people are scared to death of death. In fact, I don't know if you realize this or not, but there is actually a part of psychology called terror management. And basically this part of psychology, it believes that for people, when they come under the realization of their own mortality, it can result in a terror that debilitates and paralyzes their lives, and therefore you have to come up with ways to help yourself move beyond thinking about your own mortality. We're scared to death of death. Terror. To come to that realization that we aren't going to last forever. I mean, some of us, we're still in that place where we haven't really thought about that. We're still at that age where it hasn't dawned on us. But for those of us who are getting older, somewhere along the way, you have this realization that there are more days behind you than are ahead of you. And most people do everything they can to avoid talking about that, to avoid thinking about it. So much so, in fact, I remember a few years back, I did a funeral. And afterwards, I was talking to the family, and I said, hey, I hope that you were blessed by the service today, and I hope that the people that came, your family and friends, I hope they were really blessed by it. And they said, I think they were, but there was one complaint we got. And I said, well, tell me what it was, because I always want to do the best I can at everything that I'm doing, especially in moments like this, because I know how hard these moments are. And they said, well, somebody complained that you talked about death too much. I said, I can't help you with that. We were at a funeral. But listen, that's the way most people feel about talking. When it comes to death, we want to avoid it, which is interesting because 150 years ago, when you think about our culture, and you look back and you study, the one thing that everyone avoided talking about publicly, do you know what it was? Sex. 150 years ago, sex was pornographic. You didn't talk about it publicly. Nobody got up and said that word in a church. That was something you avoided. But death was something that everyone talked about, everyone faced. In fact, 150 years ago, when somebody was dying, you didn't send them off somewhere. They were in your house. And when they died, your family was there, and you had to get people together to go and dig a grave where you would bury that person who's died. It's all changed today. Death is pornographic. We don't like to talk about it. We don't want anybody to say anything about it, but sex is the thing that everybody's talking about all the time. We're afraid of it. And why are we afraid of it? Here's why. Because for most people, the greatest uncertainty in life is death. And fear comes from uncertainty. Your fears, and by the way, worry, stress, and anxiety are all symptoms of fear. When you're afraid, when you're anxious, when you're nervous, when you're worried, when you're stressed, the place that comes from is from uncertainty. Fear lives in the what ifs, the things that could be, the things that might happen. Right? It's looking to the future and imagining worst-case scenarios. We're not going to be able to pay the bills. My health is going to fall apart. My kids aren't going to follow Jesus. It's all of these worries and stresses, but it all lives out there somewhere in the future. And the reason that most people, and again, it's because we have these uncertainties and we're assuming the worst, and for most people, the reason they're so afraid of death is because it's what sociologist Peter Berger says. He says, we're living in a world without windows. And what he's talking about in that moment, if you want to understand what that means, think about it like driving to church this morning. Some of you are at the stage where your 15, 16-year-olds are starting to drive, right? Which is nerve-wracking enough, right? Nerve-wracking enough, but imagine the ride to church this morning without windows. Dangerous enough with windows, but without windows, impossible, right? Because what do your windows do? Hopefully, they help you see what's coming so that you can adjust and respond, so you can go in the right direction, so that you can make it from point A to point B, because you can see what's in front of you. And what Peter Berger was talking about when he says we're living in a world without windows, he's saying, listen, here's what it's like. In the past, people had windows that they looked through into eternity by faith, that they believed what was coming, and as a result, they had hope in the face of death. But as faith has waned, as we've become a culture that is defined by its doubts more than its faith, we've lost the windows and we're trying to drive without knowing what's coming. And so people are living that way and they're afraid. But do you know what the problem is with that? Right? That fear which is leading most people to avoid the conversation. Most people find it offensive to be talked to about this, and so they're avoiding it. But the problem with that is that avoidance never leads to freedom. It leads to slavery. One author put it this way. Here's what psychologists have discovered is that fear, if you avoid it, whatever it is that you fear, if you avoid it, if you don't address it, it ends up controlling you. You think that you're doing something good by pushing it off, but the reality is that it's shaping your decisions. It's shaping your life. It's what Hebrews talks about. That first passage that I read just a moment ago, let me just read it to you again. Verse 15, he says that he came to deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. See, what Hebrews is talking about is what psychologists have been discovering in our time today, that the more you fear something and avoid it, it ends up controlling you. And so that if you really want to live, you have to address this question in your life: what is next? Forget about Hugh Hefner this morning. What about you? And I understand it may be frightening for you to think about it. It may be uncomfortable for you to process. But how foolish is it for us to live ignoring the inevitable conclusion that is coming? To live as if it will never arrive, when the truth is it could arrive today. That's just fact. One day, you will breathe your last breath, and it doesn't matter how hard you work to avoid it, it's coming. And the question that you have to answer is, what then? And let me give you just 4 possible answers that people have today. 4 possible answers. And they're there in your notes. You can fill in the blanks. You can just ignore those notes, and you can just listen, whatever's going to help you best. But first answer number 1 is nothing. Nothing happens next. This is the idea that again, life, we are... Bertrand Russell, we're an accidental collocation of atoms. This is all an accident. You're a chance, right? A casino game just happened, and here you are, but there is no purpose, there's no meaning to life. You just happened, and there's nothing after this. When you breathe your last breath, curtain closes, and your life is over. It's similar to, reminds me, honestly, of, there's a story that James Dobson told about a tennis trophy. And the story goes that when he was in high school, he started getting into tennis. And he was actually really good at it. And he really wanted to kind of ride it forward into college. And he did. He rode into college. And at the college that he went to, they had a trophy that every year that they would put one name on that trophy. Right, the best player of the year, the person who had won the year, they would put that name on it, and he did everything he could to get his name put on that trophy, and he succeeded not just once, but his name was on it twice. And when he left, he said, the good news is I left believing that people would look at that trophy and think, maybe one day I will be as good as him. Fast forward 15 years. One of his friends comes to visit him. And the friend is actually carrying the trophy that had his name on it. But it looked beat up. It looked like it had been repaired. And James was surprised. Why would this trophy be out of the trophy case at the college? Why in the world would you be carrying this around? And his friend's answer absolutely shocked him, because what he found out was his friend had gone to the college, and when he was there at the college, he happened to walk past one of the dumpsters, and it was in the dumpster. You see, if there is no God, I want you to hear this. If there is no God, all of your successes, all of your victories, all of the plaques with your name on them, at one point in time, all it is trash. Samuel Beckett has a play, if you want to call it that. It's a 30-second play called Breath. And the way the play goes is it starts, the room is pitch black. And the play starts with a cry, a baby's cry, and an inhale. And as the breath is going in, as you can hear this breath, the lights begin to come up on the stage. But as you look there on the stage, strewn about the stage, flat across the stage, because he didn't want any lifting up off of the stage. He wanted it as flat as it could possibly be. Across the stage was just garbage. And the lights come up as the heartbeat is going. And it comes to its peak. Remember, it's 30 seconds long, and it comes to the peak of its brightest moment, and then it begins to fade. And as it begins to fade, there's an exhale, and there's a groan, and the lights go out. End of the story. And what's the point? The point is, if there is no God, that's all life is. It's a breath, and it's over, and all it is trash. It's just garbage. And so, see, the problem with this idea that this is it, and by the way, If this is all there is, then you and I wouldn't be afraid of death, would we? Because when we die, we won't know anything else. It will be done. It'll be over. You'll cease to exist. You'll have no consciousness after this. And so the reason that we're afraid of death, as we'll talk about later, isn't that there isn't anything, but that there is something. That's why people are actually afraid of death. And at the end of the day, I can't get up here and scientifically prove to you, well, let me show you beyond a shadow of a doubt that there is something next, but let me at least speak to you on a little bit more of a philosophical level for just a moment, is realize this. See, deep down, every single person hates the idea that this is all that there is. There's something inside of us that fights against that battles against that idea. See, there's this longing to survive. There's this longing for forever. There's a longing to last. I mean, why is it that our hearts, as we were growing up, tended to kind of resonate with stories like Peter Pan? Staying young and living forever. Why is it? Because there is this deep longing within you. You know what it is to last, to not end. As much as there are things in our culture that try to teach us that death is a friend and death is natural, every time you sit at a funeral, deep down inside of you, you see death as an enemy. And you look at that and you don't go, this is natural. You go, this is not right. Why? Why is that? See, you have longings to last. C.S. Lewis says, think about it like this. You have longings in your life. And why do you have them? You long for food. Why? Because you were created to eat. You long for water. Why? Because you were created to drink. You long for sleep. Why? Because you were created for rest. You long for those things because it's what you were designed for. There are things that can meet those longings in your life. Why is it that you long to last? The reason you long to last is because it's what you were made for. You see, what's interesting is if you don't last, if there is nothing next, then your longing to last is the one longing that has nothing to satisfy it. Every other longing has something to meet the need, something to meet the desire. You get hungry, you go out and you eat. Sometimes a little bit too much, but you have food. There's food that can satisfy. You get thirsty, there's things to drink. You get tired, you can go rest. You long for eternity and there's nothing? No, see, your longing reveals your design. This is not all that there is. Number 2, second option. There is something next, right? But it's everybody goes to heaven. The next is everyone. Everyone goes to the same place. At the end of this, God just loves everybody and we all end up in the same place. But do you know what the problem with that is? Justice. The problem with that is justice. Because here's what it means. If we die and everybody goes to the same place, then it means that God, the one who we're going to spend time with, the one we're going to go be with for all of eternity, is unjust. Why? Well, because that means that sin will never be punished. Wrongs will never be made right. It means ultimately, you need to hear this, it means ultimately that God does not care about the orphan and the widow and the oppressed and those who have been raped and those who have been murdered. God doesn't care about that because He's not going to do anything about it. And deep down, what you know in your soul, see, you long, you know there's something wrong with that because you long, and not only do you long for it, but you demand justice. I mean, think about it for a moment. Imagine being in a courtroom. And the reason that you're in that courtroom is because someone has murdered a loved one. And it's time for judgment. Now, it's beyond a shadow of doubt. This person killed that loved one. Everybody knows it. There's no question about it. The judge walks back into the room and he says, you know what? I've thought about this. Why can't we all just get along? Let's forget about this and pretend it never happened. Try to tell me in that moment that you will not be trying to figure out how to get that judge fired and how to get justice, to get that case retried because that isn't right. Deep down, there is nothing in you that would rest and to say, oh yeah, that makes sense. Totally. Let's just forget about this. Why were we even making a big deal out of it? Everything's going to be okay. Let's just be friends. Why is it that you demand justice? Where did that come from? Here's where it came from, that you were created in the image of God who is just. And the reason that you long for, that's why you long for that justice, is because you were created in His image. And God is just, which means if God is just, then rights must be wronged, sin must be punished, which means it can't just be like, well, everybody's in the same place, because that would mean God hasn't dealt with any of it. It means God's just a loving oaf in the sky. Which leads to the third option. Right, the third option is there is a heaven and hell, and that's decided. Where you go is decided on your good works. And I want you to hear me this morning. This is the belief that the majority of people live their lives by. In fact, if we went around this room and we really examined, I would say that there's a lot of us in this room who live by this. And here's what it looks like. It looks like your life is on a set of scales. And what you're always trying to do is you're trying to balance the scales. Right? You know, deep down, you know, I've got bad things on the scales. Right? I'm selfish, I'm rude, I'm unkind, I'm impatient, I've cut some people off on the road, I've gone through the checkout line with 16 instead of 15, whatever it is, you've got your list, and get me. I know that there's a lot more serious things in the room like that. I'm just being funny for a moment here. You know deep down, you've got scales tipped in the negative. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to live your life. It's this idea that if I can just tip the scales in the right direction, if I can just do enough good things, then I'll tip the scales in my favor and I'll put God in my debt. Because that's really what you're doing. You need to understand, when you are living that life, what you're trying to do is you're trying to make God owe you. So that when you breathe your last breath and you go stand before God and He examines your life, He looks at you and He goes, man, I was going to send you to the bad place, but you have done so many good things, I can't help but say, you got to come into heaven. And you've just knocked it out of the park with all the good stuff that you've done. You've really been living a good enough life. And here's the problem with that. Is good really ever good enough? Is good ever, and I want you to really think about this, can you ever possibly really tip the scales in the direction that would make God say, you've crossed the line. You've done it. You've done enough. There has never been anyone who has walked this planet who's arrived at that moment who said, yeah, I got there. And let me tell you the secret. No, see, it's this constant churning. It's this constant working, because there's this deep down sense of never arriving. It's never enough. You always are trying harder and harder with a deep down sense that you've never, ever gotten there and you're never going to get there. Francis Schaeffer said, you know what, think about it like an invisible tape recorder that's around your neck. And this invisible tape recorder only records the things that you say other people should do. Let's just forget about God's commandments. Let's forget about all God's laws, right? What are the things that you walk around, you mutter them under your breath when people don't do the things you think they should do? You know what I'm talking about. The person that's riding on your bumper, like this is the most irritating thing for me. The person when I'm riding and that person just comes up on their bumper like they're trying to encourage you to go faster. Right? If I just ride close enough, they'll really start driving faster than they already are. And I tend to just kind of click my rear view mirror down so I can't see them anymore. Right? What are the things that you say other people should do? Sadly enough, I can say that I'm guilty of doing that to other people, right? But it's justified when I do it, because they're going really slow and they really need to wake up a little bit, right? Tell me, what are the things that you say other people should do? You've got your list. You know what it is. And imagine at the end of your life, God takes that tape recorder off your neck and He says, let's see how well you did. And He hits play and He examines your life, not on His law, but your law. If you are honest, here's what you realize. Not only do you not measure up to God's law, but you don't even measure up to your own law. And not only that, hear this morning. This idea that if you do enough good works for God that you can earn heaven puts you in an impossible situation. Because here's what I would tell you. If you buy into that model, it is impossible for you to do good works. I want you to I'm going to say it again because this is so deep-rooted in some of us, it's been ingrained into our brains. You've grown up in churches, and you have a natural bent in this direction anyway, but you have grown up in churches that have taught you that the way that you get into the good place is by doing enough good things. Sure, you got to believe, yeah. But you don't just believe, you've got to do the good things to earn getting in at the same time. You've been trained to think that way, but you need to understand, if you believe that the way that you get into heaven is by doing enough good works, you cannot do good works. You can't. And here's why I'll share an illustration with you. And some of you have heard this illustration before, but I think it's a really important one. I want you to imagine next week we've got a number of people that go and serve at Lakewood Nursing Home. Second Sunday of every month, we've got a team that goes and they minister to people there. And I want you to imagine that there at the nursing home, there is a man by the name of Bill. There isn't really. It's just an illustration, but maybe there is. But I'm not talking about a real person. There's a man named Bill at the nursing home. His family has abandoned him. No one ever comes to visit him. He is alone. But then one day, a man named Joe, young guy, lots of energy. You can imagine he's got a job and a family, plenty of things going on in his life. But this guy, Joe, he comes and he starts visiting Bill at the nursing home. He goes, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to join the nursing home ministry. Second Sunday every month, I'm not just doing that. I'm going every single week. I'm going to go spend time with Joe. I'm going to invest in him. I'm going to get to know him. I want to find out all about his life. If you were just to look at that on the surface, would you say that Joe is doing good works? Is that a good work? Most people would say yes. Why? Well, because, let me ask just this question. What is a good work? If you were to say, here's what a good work is, how would you describe it? I'm asking a question you can actually answer. I know this is unusual, but I want an answer. So, what's that? Helping someone? Anybody else? All right, so doing something for someone else. What else? Anything else? Okay. That's good. I know, again. Who wants us to talk right now? Yeah. Doing something for someone else. All right, so Joe's doing that, right? If we're going to balance the scales, we go, well, Joe's going every week. He must be really balancing the scales. He's doing a lot of good things, right? But I want you to imagine that for a moment we could see Joe's motives. We can see into his heart. Now, we actually can't do that. We spend a lot of time judging people's motives without being able to actually know them, sadly. But imagine we could. Imagine we could see his motives, and we find out that under the surface, the reason Joe has started to visit him is because somehow he found out that Bill's a millionaire. Bill's a millionaire. And he knows, here's this guy, he's a millionaire. No one is visiting him, so you know what we should do? I'm going to go and start visiting with the hopes that he writes me into his will. I'll inherit all of his money because nobody else cares about him. And so the reason that he's going is to get the millions out of Bill's life. Is it still a good work? If we're honest. Now, I've had people say to me, well, yeah, sure, it's still a good work. But if we're honest, we have to say no. Why? Because what that is selfishness. You're not doing it for Bill. You're doing it for Joe. Joe would be doing it for himself. And see, here's why. If you're trying to earn salvation from God by doing good works for God, you're not doing good works. You're actually doing things for yourself. You're being selfish. See, man-made religion puts you in an impossible situation because it says do enough good things for God so that God owes you heaven. But what you're really doing in that moment is you're not doing them for God. You're doing them for yourself. So they're not really good works anymore. That's why the prophet Isaiah could write in Isaiah chapter 64, verse 6, even your most righteous deeds, not your evil deeds, your righteous deeds are but a menstruous cloth. That's the literal translation. They're filthy rags. They're gross to God. When it comes to earning salvation from God, your good works are worthless to God because at the end of the day, because of your broken fallenness, when you're doing them, you're not doing them for God, you're doing them for you. And see, this is why people are really afraid of death. It's not just uncertainty. See, we're not afraid of death because we think there's nothing next. Right, the Greek philosopher Epicurus put it this way. He said the way he put it is this: what men fear is not that death is annihilation, the end of existence, but that it is not. That one day we are going to stand before God. We're going to stand before the Creator. In Revelation chapter 20, and I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne. And listen, and books were opened. Then another book was opened, which is the book of life, and the dead were judged by what was written in the books according to what they had done. See, that's the real fear. The real fear is that my life is going to get examined. That God isn't going to just look on the surface of my behaviors and the things that I did, that God's going to go under the surface, that He's actually going to look at the motivations of my heart even in those things. And that deep down my sense is, if that's what happens, if Hebrews chapter 9 is a fact, that as every man is destined to die and after that comes judgment, if that's a fact, that I'm going to face an examination of my life, then deep down the sense is, I have no hope. If that's the case, then we should be afraid. But see, that's where the fourth option comes in. Right? And the fourth option is the gospel. Right? Look at the rest of these two verses for just a moment. And we're going to start in chapter 2. Chapter 2, listen to verse 14. Since therefore the children shared in flesh and blood, He Himself, Jesus, likewise partook of the same things. We saw it over the last week, you remember? And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The one through whom all things were made. That one stepped into creation and He took on flesh and blood. And why did He do that? Listen, here's why He did it. He Himself partook of the same things, that through death He might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. He says, listen, the reason that you're living in slavery is you're afraid of death. And Jesus says, the reason that I came and took on flesh and blood, the reason that I came into creation was to set you free from that fear. And the way that He sets us free is in a way that we never would have expected. Because what does it say? Listen, He says that by death, that through death, He might destroy the one who has the power of death. It's in a way that we never would have expected. It's a way that we never would have planned. In fact, if you want to hear it, it's 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Here, listen what it says. Paul writes this. He says, the sting of death is sin. In other words, the thing that causes death, the reason that we all die is because of sin, which is why everybody dies, because everybody has sin. The thing that causes death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. The reason sin has power is because when it comes to the law, what the law tells us and what sin reminds us is we don't measure up. And not only do we measure up, but we can never measure up. Right? The law is not a stairway to get back to God if I just can keep enough of these rules. Romans chapter 3 says it's a wall, so that every time I try, I run into it. Every time I try, I fail. Every time I try, it's another failure, it's another sin, it's another mistake, it's another error, it's another going away from God in a direction that I shouldn't go. I'm just keep hitting my head against this wall. That's what the law is there to do. And see, sin has power in your life because the law tells you you're condemned, and the reality is you are condemned. Why? Because you don't measure up to God. But here's what Jesus has done. By death, He's defeated the one who has the power of death, that is sin. And how did He defeat it? Here's how He defeated it. That Jesus comes and He lived the life that you could not live. That life, by the way, of good works that so many people go, well, if I can just do enough good things to balance out the bad. See, Jesus comes and He doesn't have to balance out the bad because He keeps all of it perfectly. See, the gospel isn't just that Jesus died on the cross. The gospel is that Jesus lived your life perfectly for you. He did what you could not do and what you will never be able to do in this life. He kept the law. Perfectly righteous. But then when He goes to the cross, that He died the death that we deserved in our place, that God on that cross poured out all the judgment and wrath that our sins deserved on Jesus in our place. That Jesus took your sin on Himself for you, suffered the judgment that we deserved, Condemned we stood. Jesus condemned in our place, lays down his life, dies, is buried, rises again, conquers sin and death, punches a hole in the wall of death so that you no longer have to live in that fear anymore. Comes and conquers that so that you can actually be set free. Do you understand what that means? See, if that's true, see, if it isn't true, you have reason to be afraid. We shouldn't talk about death. We should avoid thinking about it, even though it's the inevitable conclusion. There is no hope within it. If this is not true, then there is no hope for you, because you will never balance out the scales. You will never be good enough. But see, if this is true, here's what it means. Death, who was once an enemy. Do you understand what Jesus has done to death is made death a friend? He's robbed death of its power. You know what death has become a gardener. Right? You know what a gardener does. Right? Gardener takes something that's died, a seed, and puts it in the ground so that it can do what? So that it can become something better. And you see, that's the thing. That's all that death can do to you. Death doesn't have any power over you, because when you die, if you are in Christ, here's what we're being found out. Here's what we're finding out is that at the end of the day, when I die and when I'm put in the ground, all death can do is make me better. Death is but a dark door that I go through, and on the other side is the very glory of heaven. Beyond my understanding, a place of joy unspeakable. Psalm 16 verse 11 says, in your presence is joy unspeakable. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. See, the death is simply a dark door that when I walk through it, I'm in the presence of God. The casket is but a chrysalis. All it can do is give me wings to fly. Which means I don't have to be afraid of it anymore. Which means no longer does it control me, but it's actually set me free. And some of us here this morning, I believe, desperately need this. Because you're living controlled by it. You're living in fear of it. I know some people wake up or can't even go to sleep. Because as you're drifting off to sleep, that question in the back of your mind is, am I going to wake up in the morning? And you're wrestling with that reality of your own mortality. Shaping it is defining you. And Jesus comes and says, I want to set you free from that. But understand, here's what it means. Let me just give you 4 quick thoughts. Number 1, it means there's a choice. There's a choice. See, books are going to be opened. Our lives will be examined. But there's one book that trumps all the others, and it's the book of life. It's the book of the Lamb. And it's a question of whose name is written in the book. And the only way your name gets written in that book is if you've stopped practicing man-made religion. If you've stopped practicing the trying to balance the scales and just be good enough. If you stopped relying on yourself, and understand, any time that you say it's Jesus plus something, the thing that ultimately saves you is whatever the something is, not Jesus. So if you say it's Jesus plus good works, then what you really believe is the thing that saves you is good works. If it's Jesus plus faithfulness, if it's Jesus plus obedience, if it's Jesus plus anything, the thing that you believe ultimately saves you is the anything else. The only way your name gets written in the book is if you give up on the something, or you give up on the anything else, and you say, no, it's not Jesus plus something else, it's Jesus alone. It is truly by grace alone, through faith alone, that no one in this room has the ability to boast. I don't have the ability to get up here and go, you want to know why I'm a Christian? Man, because I get up every morning and I spend time in the Word and I pray enough and I come here and I preach and I work hard and I go and visit people and I do all the right things. That's why I'm going to heaven. You need to work harder. No, that's not the message at all. The message is Jesus has done all the work. That's why I'm a Christian. That's what makes me a Christian. Jesus has done it all. There's nothing else that I can add to it. And so the question is your name written in the book? Because if it's not, understand that the other books are what you're really going to be examined by, which is all the things that you've done. And what I've already said is you can never balance out the scales. And so the end of the story is you're going to stand condemned. An NFL football player. He's now an analyst, but he played for the best team in the whole world, my people, the Giants. I know that's a laughing matter, but listen. Back when the solar eclipse happened, he's a believer, and listen to what he says. He says, the sun will burn your eyes out at 92 million miles, and you expect to casually stroll into the presence of its creator. He says, you understand? You understand for just a moment. You can't look at the sun without the right eyewear. You have to have protection, and if you do, try to look at it without the right protection over your eyes, you'll go blind, and you think you can walk into the presence of God without protection? There's only one protection that you can have to walk into the presence of God and to not stand condemned, and it's Jesus Christ and His finished work on the cross and the empty tomb. That's it. Anything else, and you're going to be blind. You're already blind. I mean, listen. Everybody knows John 3:16, right? But let me just read to you the rest of it. Right? For God so loved the world that He gave His only Son, that whoever believes in Him should not perish but have eternal life. End of the story. For most people, just stop there. But I want you to hear the rest of this. For God did not send His Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through Him. Whoever believes in Him is not condemned. But whoever does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only Son of God. There is one critical question that if you answer it wrong, it will shape all of your eternity, and it's the question that God is going to ask you above all of the other questions. What did you do with my son? Did you play games with him? Did you try to use him as a little special help as you were trying to do enough good works in order to earn my grace? Or did you totally throw your life on him and say, there is no other hope but you? I can't do it. I can't earn it. Jesus, the only hope I have is that one day I stand before the presence of God. And he asks that question. Some of us know the question. When God says, why should I let you into heaven? And the answer is, I've got one hope, and it's your son, Jesus. If you can't say that, then you haven't answered that question in the way that you need to. And this morning, if you're here, I believe God has brought you here so that you can answer that question right. And it's time to stop playing games. It's time to stop just drifting through and going, I'll figure that out someday. It's time to figure it out today. To believe. Today. Would you do that? Number two, if you've already believed, you know what you and I need to practice is mindfulness. To remember. You know, one of the armor of God, and I'm just going to be real quick with this, but the armor of God is the helmet of salvation. You know, the helmet of salvation, you know, it guards your mind. And that helmet of salvation is the hope of eternity. That confident assurance of the salvation that has been purchased for you already. Most of us walk through life and we're completely unaware because we're so caught up in just the day-to-day stuff. What if every morning you got up and you said, God, if today's the last day, I know where my hope is. And I want to use it well. God, help me to be aware, to remember where my home really is. To live in light of that hope. When stuff goes wrong today, I want to live in light of that hope that I've got. When there's conflict with my kids, I want to remember eternity in that moment, not to escape, but to bring it into this moment. When there's trouble at work, God, I want to remember that there is a greater glory that's coming. It's not even worth comparing to the suffering of this life. When I'm dealing with cancer and I'm dealing with the sickness in my life, I want to remember that hope. God, guard my mind from losing that tether to hope. Number two, if I've already believed, then I got to practice intimacy. Eternal life is about knowing God. John chapter 17, verse 3, that's what eternal life is all about. And let me tell you, one of my concerns for God's people today is that when we walk through that door one day, we're going to be walking into a stranger's house because we only know about him, we don't know him personally. It's one thing, we went to a restaurant with some guys last night. I was asking one of them, hey, how do you know about this place? He said, my cousin goes here all the time. Right? He knows the owner's over there. See, it's one thing to actually know the owner, it's another thing to know about the owner. And see, some of us here, we know about the owner of heaven, but we don't know him personally. Not really. And that has to change. That has to change. That takes investment. It takes time. It takes communication. It takes listening and talking. And listen, that happens in the context of getting into God's Word outside of just a Sunday morning and spending time in prayer and actually talking to Him. You have to develop a relationship with the God of the universe who loves you. And instead of seeing it as a duty that I got to check off, what a gift. That He wants to be with you, wants to spend time with you. And the last thing, let me just give you one last thing. For those of us who have belief, we got to practice invitation. I could go off on this for a while, so I have to be very careful. There's a lot of news out there that talks about the Church of the United States and saying that it's declining. In fact, the average congregation is losing about 7 to 8% attendance a year. And people go, well, why is that? Why is that? You know what it might be? Maybe we don't have enough programming. Maybe the preaching isn't good enough, or maybe we need better music, or we need a better building, and that'll solve it all. I want you to just hear this morning. Man, that was like back in the 80s. If you think that's what's going to change the world today, then we have got, Holy Spirit, we need you to wake us up. The culture is not banging down the doors of the church. It's trying to blockade us in. People aren't coming in and going, tell us about Jesus because we really want to know. They're out there this morning. They're sleeping in. And they're not going, boy, I really need to go to church. The majority of people are not saying that. And so if we're thinking that the way we're going to change the world is by having better music, having better preaching, having a better building, or more programs, then we've bought into a lie that Satan is going, man, great job. I'm not saying that we shouldn't work at any of those things. We should do everything to the glory of God. It should be the best that we can give it. But the only way the world gets to hear the gospel is if you and I go out those doors and we invite them. Not into a building, but into a relationship. Where we care about the people out there. And we get to know them, and we get into their lives, and they get to know they get to know us. Listen to me very carefully. If we are so busy being the church inside of these walls that we don't have the time to go outside of these walls, then we are not being the church. We have failed. And the reason that the church is not growing today is because we're still buying into a model that worked 20 years ago, hoping that somehow it's going to change the world. I guarantee you, I don't have the evidence to prove it, but I guarantee you that for the churches that are growing, many of them are growing because 7% are leaving the other churches and going over there. The world is not being changed. The majority of people are not hearing the gospel because we're still hoping the pastor's going to get it done. And if we believe what we're talking about this morning, if we really believe that we have the hope of heaven, that one day we're going to go through that door and we're going to get into the presence of God into joy unspeakable, and we don't do anything with it, God help us. I know. Dan's getting passionate and excited again. Man, if we don't get excited and passionate about this, then what are we doing? If this doesn't shake us, and we're just a club. And as much as I love you all, there's better clubs. Jesus came and He says, I've broken the power of death. You're free. There's a whole world out there that isn't yet. What are we going to do about it?